Welcome to the third installment in our Magic the Gathering tutorial series, Timing. In previous episodes, we learned that the object of the game is to reduce your opponent's life to 0, usually by attacking them with creatures. We learned that permanents often have abilities, some of which are so common that they are given keywords, like flying. Finally, we also learned about different card types like instants, sorceries, enchantments, artifacts, and planeswalkers. If you haven't had a chance to try out what you've learned, this is a great place to grab a friend and play a game. After all, experience is the best teacher. Things will get a bit more complicated in this video, so we'd recommend that you play a bit with a friend to be sure you thoroughly understand the content in the previous tutorials before moving on. In this video, we will go into more detail about the parts of a turn. We'll take a closer look at creature combat, and we'll discuss what the stack is and how important timing can be. Most spells in Magic the Gathering are considered sorcery speed. That means that these cards represent slower, more powerful spells, like creatures and enchantments, which can only be played during one of your main phases and never when other spells or effects are happening. On the other hand, the spell type instant represents faster acts of magic which can be cast as a response to your opponent's spells and effects. So for example, you cannot play an artifact or a planeswalker in response to another spell. Instant speed spells and abilities, on the other hand, allow you to act in response to your opponent's spells and abilities. For example, when your opponent casts a spell which would kill one of your creatures, you may cast an instant to protect it. Each spell cast in response to another goes on top of the last in an imaginary construct we call the stack. None of the spell's effects are resolved until neither player wishes to play another spell. Then, each spell is resolved in reverse order from when it was cast, so that the spells cast most recently resolve first. A handy acronym to remember how this works is FILO, or First In, Last Out. Let's take a look at two spells and how the order they are cast in makes all the difference. Imagine that your opponent has a Giant Growth in hand, which reads, target creature gets +3/+3 until end of turn, and you have a Lightning Bolt, which says, Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to target creature or player. We'll take a look at two separate scenarios and see how casting the spells in a different sequence yields completely different results. In the first instance, you begin the stack by casting the Lightning Bolt targeting your opponent's Runeclaw Bear. Once you cast the Lightning Bolt, it goes on the stack and your opponent gets the chance to respond. Your opponent then casts Giant Growth, which goes on the stack above the Lightning Bolt. Once each player declines to add any more spells to the stack, we begin resolving the spells, starting with the last one cast, which will be on top. In this case, Giant Growth is the last spell cast and sits on the top of the stack, so we will resolve it first. The Giant Growth gives the Runeclaw Bear +3/+3, making it into a 5/5. Next, the Lightning Bolt will resolve and deal 3 points of damage to the bear. Since the bear is now a 5/5, 3 points of damage is not enough to kill it, and it will survive the Lightning Bolt. Let's see what happens if the two spells are cast in the opposite order. Remember FILO, or First In, Last Out. If your opponent begins the stack by casting Giant Growth on his Runeclaw Bear, and you respond by casting your Lightning Bolt, the first spell in was Giant Growth, so it will be the last one out. The Lightning Bolt on top of the stack will resolve first and deal 3 points of damage to the Runeclaw Bear. Since the Giant Growth is still in the stack and hasn't resolved, the bear is only a 2/2 and the Lightning Bolt will kill it. With the creature Giant Growth targeted no longer on the battlefield when it resolves, the Giant Growth will fizzle and be placed into the graveyard. Activated and triggered abilities also go on the stack, just like spells do. For instance, say you have an Eager Cadet on the battlefield, which is a 1/1 creature, and your opponent has a Rod of Ruin, which has the ability, pay 3 mana and tap Rod of Ruin. Rod of Ruin deals 1 damage to target creature or player. If your opponent activates their Rod of Ruin, targeting your Eager Cadet, that ability goes on the stack just as though it were a spell that had been cast. You may respond to it by activating another ability or playing a spell, like Giant Growth, which, being the last effect placed onto the stack, will resolve first and save your Eager Cadet. Since players can cast spells and take other actions even on their opponent's turn, the term priority is used to clarify who has the opportunity to act at any given time. Each player receives priority once at the end of every part of the turn, always beginning with the player whose turn it is. Each player also receives priority every time a spell or ability goes onto the stack, and every time a spell or ability resolves from the stack. To illustrate priority a little further, let's check out a part of a game in real time. First main phase, Runeclaw Bear.
Okay.
Combat phase?
I'm gonna Lightning Bolt the Centaur Courser.
Alright, good. Now, let's take a look at what really happened during that sequence. During his main phase, the active player casts a Runeclaw Bear, placing it on the stack. He has priority, then passes priority to his opponent. His opponent has no response and passes priority back. The Runeclaw Bear resolves. It is now on the battlefield. The active player does not have a response and passes priority. His opponent has no response and priority is passed back. The active player announces the end of his main phase and passes priority. Before the end of the main phase, his opponent casts a Lightning Bolt. The active player has no response. Lightning Bolt resolves, and the active player again has no response. His opponent has no further spells. The phase is over. Now don't worry about all of that. Remember, this is what it actually looks like during a game. First main phase, Runeclaw Bear.
Okay.
Combat phase?
I'm gonna lightning bolt the Centaur Courser.
Alright, good. Don't worry if it seems complicated, just remember this. Every time something happens, like a spell being cast, a spell resolving, or a player moving to the next part of the turn, each player gets a chance to react. Now that we've covered priority in the stack, let's take a closer look at how the turn is structured. The first thing to happen on every turn is the untap step. The player whose turn it is simply untaps all of their permanents and the game proceeds to the next step. From here on, each player will receive priority at the end of each part of the turn and after every time a spell or ability is put onto the stack or resolves. Now that we are taking a closer look at the turn, we thought it was a good time to mention upkeep. The upkeep step is associated with paying ongoing costs for certain cards, hence the name upkeep. During the first video, we skipped over the upkeep step because in many games of Magic, nothing happens here. After that comes the draw step, when the active player will draw their card for the turn. Next up is the first main phase. This is the active player's first opportunity to cast sorcery speed spells like creatures and artifacts. When the active player is ready, he may move to combat. It is important to note that the active player cannot simply tap his creatures to attack and skip the opponent's chance to have priority. As with all phases of the turn, each player gets priority during the first main phase, and the active player should announce that he is passing priority by saying something like, "Move to my combat phase."
Okay.
The combat phase is split into 5 parts: beginning of combat, declare attackers, declare blockers, combat damage, and the end of combat. During each of these steps, players will first perform the appropriate action, such as declaring attackers, and then each player will get priority. So after each player has passed priority during the beginning of combat phase, the active player declares which creatures are attacking, then priority is passed back and forth. Next, the defending player decides how he wants to block, and each player gets priority again. Finally, creatures deal their combat damage and priority goes back and forth one more time before the end of the combat phase. After combat is a second main phase, which is identical to the first, followed by the end step. At the beginning of the end step, each player receives priority one last time. Next comes the cleanup step, in which players do not receive priority. Instead, the active player discards down to 7 cards, since this is the maximum hand size at the end of turn. This is also when any effects that last until end of turn cease, such as the +3/+3 to power and toughness granted by the instant Giant Growth. Once this all happens, the turn is over. In this tutorial, we learned that timing is essential. The stack is used when players wish to respond to spells or abilities by casting their own spells or abilities. Every new spell or ability cast in response to another goes on top of the stack until no one wishes to add to it. Then spells begin to resolve, starting with the most recently cast. FILO, or First In, Last Out, is a handy acronym to remember this by. Whenever a spell or ability goes on the stack, resolves, or when play moves to the next part of a turn, each player, beginning with the active player, gets a chance to respond when they receive priority. Instants can be cast anytime a player has priority, but sorcery speed spells like creatures, artifacts, and sorceries can only be played during a player's own main phase, and only if there's nothing currently on the stack. Finally, we covered the 5 parts of the combat phase: beginning of combat, declare attackers, declare blockers, combat damage, and end of combat. Timing is an important part of Magic the Gathering, and understanding how these elements work is a powerful tool. Just don't get too bogged down in the details. Take the next opportunity to grab a friend and play a game of Magic. After all, experience is the best teacher.